In this video, we'll be learning how to determine the probability that an event will occur, and we'll be able to determine the odds that an event will occur, and we'll be able to explain the difference between probability and odds. So before we dive into probability and odds, there are a couple of vocab terms that we have to talk about. The first vocab term that we need to talk about is this word outcomes. And an outcome are the possible results of an experiment. So when we think about multiple types of experiments that we could perform, one of them is rolling a dice. So if we think about it, the outcomes when we roll a dice could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So when we're talking about outcomes, we're talking about all of the possible things that could result. When we roll a normal dice, that results in numbers 1 through 6 appearing on the dice. Then the second word we need to know is event. An event is an outcome or a collection of outcomes. So for example, while we have 6 outcomes up here for rolling a dice, rolling a 6 is a specific event that could take place. Or rolling an odd number is also a specific event that could take place that contains a collection of outcomes, because rolling an odd number would use a 1, a 3, or a 5. Now the final term we need to know is favorable outcomes, and these are outcomes for the event specified. So for example, say that our event is when we roll an odd number. A favorable outcome would be when we actually roll an odd number. So that would mean a 1, a 3, or a 5. The 2, 4, and 6 would be unfavorable outcomes because they don't meet the specifications outlined in the event that we were hoping to see. So we're going to use the equation below to calculate the probability of an event. So the P here stands for probability. And when we have an event, that's whatever we're trying to calculate the probability for. Now, the equation for this is created by taking the number of favorable outcomes in the numerator and the number of total outcomes in the denominator. Now, the easiest way to actually practice this is to do a couple of examples. So, for example, say we wanted to do the probability of rolling a 4 on a normal-sided dice. When we roll, we know that the possible outcomes are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the number of favorable outcomes are any that make our event true, which would be simply 4. As a result, because there's only one outcome that makes this true, our number of favorable outcomes would be 1. Then in our denominator, we calculate the number of total outcomes. So here we can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 total outcomes. So we have a 6 in our denominator. So our probability of rolling a 4 is 1/6. 1, because that's the number of favorable outcomes, over 6, which is our number of total outcomes. Now let's try a second example. Say we have the probability of rolling an even number. So here, probability is created by taking the number of favorable outcomes in the top. So we have 1 favorable outcome, 2 favorable outcomes, 3 favorable outcomes. There are 3 favorable outcomes that result in an even number. And then we take our denominator to be the total number of outcomes, which is 6. So here we have a fraction of 3/6. And because we know that this simplifies further, we're going to divide each of these by 3 and find that the probability is a simplified fraction of 1/2. Now, in order to practice probability, we're going to use a deck of cards. And because I know you might not be familiar with this, we're actually going to break down what a deck of cards is before we use it. So here we know that in a deck of cards, we have 52 total cards. Within that deck of cards, half of the cards are red and half of the cards are black. So we have different colored cards. Now, 52 divided by 2 is going to split that 52 perfectly in half. So here we have 26 red cards and we have 26 black cards. Now, Amongst these 52 cards, the 26 red split into 2 suits and the 26 black split into 2 suits for a total of 4 different suits of cards. So the 26 red cards break down into hearts and they break into diamonds. Then the black cards break down into the suits of spades and clubs. So, in order to figure out how many cards are in each of these, we have 2 ways we can go about it. The 26 red cards and the 26 black cards each split evenly amongst their 2 suits, or you can take the 52 cards and divide it by 4 to get how many cards are split up evenly between the 4 suits. If we do that, 52 divided by 4 or 26 divided by 2, we end up with 13 hearts, 13 diamonds, 13 spades, and 13 clubs. So we have 13 cards within each suit. Now, the last thing you need to know is what the cards within each suit are. So the hearts, we have a 1, which also you can think of as the ace card. They double as the same. It's worth 1 or ace. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We also have 9 and 10. So we have the cards 1 through 10. And then we have Jack, a Queen, and a King. So we have 13 different cards. We have the Ace of Hearts, the 2 of Hearts, the 3 of Hearts, so on and so forth. Now, all of these types of cards spread and apply to the diamonds, the spades, and the clubs. So the diamonds have the same 13 cards, but they're diamonds. The spades have the same 13 cards, but they're spades, and the same with the clubs. So we're going to use this information to practice probability on the next page, because a deck of cards gives us, and it kind of expands to allow us to practice probability in a lot of different situations. So let's practice a number of these. So the first one here says, what is the probability, so I'm going to use the letter P, that you pick a red card? Now remember, probability is calculated by taking the number of favorable outcomes over the total. So number of favorable outcomes, we know that there are 26 red cards in a deck. So we have 26 favorable outcomes, and then we have 52 total cards, or 52 total outcomes. So our probability is 26 over 52. Now we need to simplify this down, so I'm going to divide by 2, so I get 13 over 26. I can divide each of those by 13, so I end up with a probability of 1/2. Then if I look down at the next problem, it says, what is the probability that you pick a king? Now when I look at a deck of cards, if I look back on the previous slide, I notice that I have the King of Hearts, the King of Spades, the King of Diamonds, and the King of Clubs. So there are 4 favorable outcomes because there are 4 kings in a deck out of 52 total cards. 4 divided by 52, we can simplify that a little bit. Each divide by 2, so we get 2 over 26. Those divide by 2 again, so we get 1 over 13. The next one says, what is the probability that you pick a heart? Well, when I look at my deck of cards, I notice that I have 13 possible hearts. So my number of favorable outcomes is 13. And then from here, probability that I pick a heart in the bottom, we put the total, which is 52. So for each of these, we take, and we can divide it by 13 to get a probability of 1/4. This next one here is a little more difficult. It says, what is the probability that you pick an odd number? Now I kind of have to think through this one a little bit more. So I know that in each deck of cards, there's a 1, a 2, a 3, a 5, a 7, and a 9. So each suit has 5 odd numbers. So I have 5 odd numbers times 4 total suits, which gives me 20. So I have 20 favorable outcomes over 52, which is our total. These each divide by 2, so I get 10 over 26. These each divide by 2 as well, so I get 5 over 13 as my probability. And then finally, this last one here says, what is the probability that you pick a red queen? Well, in a deck of cards, I know that I have 4 total queens, 1 in each suit, but only 2 of them are red, the Queen of Diamonds and the Queen of Hearts. So we have 2 out of 52. That's our favorable over our total. We divide each by 2, and we end up with 1 over 26. So probability seems pretty easy until we throw odds into the mix. And while probability and odds are kind of used interchangeably in our society, they are not actually interchangeable when we are working with math. So probability, we know, and I'm going to make a little note over here. Probability is the number of favorable outcomes over the total. But if you look here at the equation for odds, while the number in the top is the number of favorable, it's the number of unfavorable outcomes in the bottom. So it's not the total in the bottom, but the number of unfavorable outcomes. So let's figure out the odds that we roll a 4. So again, when I'm rolling a dice, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I have 6 possible outcomes here. The number of favorable outcomes, if I'm going to roll a 4, is 1. It's just the 4. However, the bottom is not going to be 6 because the bottom is not the total. The bottom is the number of unfavorable outcomes, so everything that is not a 4. So that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, which means we have 5 unfavorable outcomes. So notice the slight change here about how odds is different than probability. Odds is favorable over unfavorable. Now, the next one says, what are the odds that we roll an even number? So here, again, if I list them out, an even number, the odds that we roll an even number, the number of favorable outcomes is 1, 2, 3. We have 3 even numbers, so we have 3 favorable outcomes. Now remember, the bottom is not total. The bottom is unfavorable. So here I have 1, 2, 3 unfavorable outcomes. So I have 3 in the top and 3 in the bottom. Notice it's 3 favorable to 3 unfavorable. Now these are both divisible by 3 and would simplify to 1 over 1. So again, notice the difference. It's not favorable over total, it's favorable over unfavorable. And then finally, the odds that we roll a 2 or 3. So favorable, we have 2 or 3, which is 2. We have 2 favorable outcomes. And then we have 1, 4, 5, and 6, which are our unfavorable outcomes. So we have 4 in the bottom. So we have 2 favorable to 4 unfavorable. These are each divisible by 2, so our odds would be 1 to 2. So notice that slight difference between probability and odds. So the last thing I want to do here is I want to compare and contrast these together. So remember, probability is calculated by taking the number of favorable over the total. And odds is calculated by taking the number of favorable, again in the top, with the number of unfavorable in the bottom. So to kind of show you an example or two, let's say we want to find the probability of selecting a king out of a deck of cards. We know that there are 4 kings in a deck, so our favorable is 4, and our total is going to be 52 in the bottom. Now, we can simplify that fraction, but I don't want to focus on that right now. I want to focus on the differences in how we write the fraction. We did favorable over total. Now, if we do the odds of a king, again, the number of favorable is 4. However, the bottom is not 52. The bottom is the number of unfavorable. So if we have 52 total cards and 4 of them are favorable, we're left with 48 that are unfavorable. So notice the slight difference. We had 4 over 52, the total, and then 4 over 48, the unfavorable. And then each of these fractions would simplify, this one to 1 over 13 and this one to 1 over 12. Now, similarly, say we did the probability of picking a heart. We know there are 13 favorable and 52 total. So our probability of picking a heart is 13 over 52. But our odds of picking a heart is going to be 13 over unfavorable. So if we have 13 favorable, we need to subtract those out, and we find that there are 39 unfavorable. So again, notice the slight changes in the fractions. If we simplify these, this becomes 1 over 4, and this becomes 1/3. So make sure you pay really close attention to if a problem is asking for probability or a problem is asking for odds.